Hi, I'm David Batchelor.
And I'm Jason Calleja, and we're financial planners that are experts in the financial planning considerations with career transition.
So in this video, we're going to touch on some of the common financial planning issues that seem to arise typically when going through career transition, and we're going to give you some tips on how to tackle them.
Yeah, so there are some key areas to consider, including maximising your redundancy payment and protecting your insurances, reviewing your superannuation, your assets and your debt, and really understanding your budget, particularly how to best meet your short and medium-term expenses.
Yeah, look, let's face it, I mean, going through career transition can be pretty tough, both personally and financially. So look, we think it's pretty important that some of those issues that you just mentioned, that they don't sort of slip through the cracks, you know, as you sort of go through this change of your career and your finances. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time just talking about maximising your redundancy payment. And I guess when we talk about that, we're not talking about maximising the actual payment itself, but really just making sure that you're making the most of the payment when you do actually receive it. And I guess the things that we think about firstly when we speak to clients is focusing firstly on the short-term issues. And often that really relates to just making sure you've got enough cash to fund your short-term expenses. So the things that we'll often think about there are maybe to put the money into like a cash account, maybe a high yielding cash account where you can access the money quite quickly. Or for those people who've still got a mortgage, we'll often suggest that they put the money into an offset account where they can, again, access it, you know, whenever they need it. And irrespective of what option you select, a good strategy we'll often think about for clients is setting up a regular direct debit from that account, which helps to sort of fund their day-to-day living expenses and effectively replicates the income that they had previously.
And then once you've addressed the short-term needs, it's then important to start looking at the medium to long-term considerations. So these include looking at repaying or reducing your debt, and this includes credit cards, car loans, mortgages, investment loans, those type of things there. Possibly also looking at making additional super contributions. So depending on the amount and size of the redundancy payment, you could look at making pre-tax contributions or post-tax contributions. And then finally, looking at investing outside of super. So you may want to retain access to those funds. So looking at things like, depending on the size of the payment, shares, managed funds and investment property could be appropriate.
So we actually find that changing employment is often a really good trigger for reviewing your super. And so it's probably worthwhile just spending a little bit of time talking about super and investments. And there's a few things that we would typically suggest that you review. Firstly, the type of super fund that you're in, what sort of investment option you've selected within your super fund. Thirdly, I guess, the types of super contributions that you can make and I guess whether you can and should be making them. And then I guess the pros and cons of making those super contributions. So we might just spend a little bit of time just talking about each of those in a bit of detail.
So each type of super fund has its pros and its cons. To give you an example, an industry fund is relatively low cost and cheap, which is good, but on the downside, it's quite limited in terms of the investment options and very low touch, low service.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of bells and whistles with industry super funds, do you?
Exactly, it's very basic.
Yeah.
Conversely, there's retail funds and self-managed super funds, which give you access to a lot wider range of investment options, so you can manage it in a more professional manner. But with that comes a higher expense, so whether that makes sense or not really depends on your needs again. And then the other type, which is quite important to understand, is corporate super funds. So depending on your employer that you're coming from, they may have had an employer super plan. And what that means is they subsidise a lot of the costs associated with the plan. So that could be the ongoing administration fees or the insurance premiums. So as part of moving out of that employer, you may actually move from what they call the corporate division to the personal division. And with that can mean a change in your fees, so they can be higher, and also the insurance premiums can go up. So it's important to really understand these.
Okay, so no matter what type of super fund you've got, how it's invested is probably one of the most important things that we think you should be thinking about with your super. And firstly, I should point out that superannuation isn't an asset itself, like property or shares or bonds or whatever. I mean, you've got absolute choice as to where you invest your super, and you can be as conservative, or as aggressive as you want to be with your super. So I guess one thing that we do recommend for most people is it's important to have a bit of an in-depth look as to where you are invested and how much risk that you're taking on. And importantly, don't just accept the default option that comes with most super funds, because it might actually be appropriate for you.
Yeah, because what we find, one of the misconceptions is when people are comparing super funds, so super fund A with super fund B, they're looking at the performance numbers, but not necessarily understanding what risk each fund is taking. So it's quite important to understand the different levels of growth and defensive assets. So what growth assets are, think of assets like shares, property, infrastructure. So more volatile, but in saying that, they're expected to generate a higher return over the long term. Conversely, defensive assets are things like cash and bonds, more stable, so not as much volatility, but the returns are expected to be lower, and especially in the current environment, with interest rates so low, it's quite difficult to generate a return there. But the purpose is to really protect that side of the portfolio.
Yeah, so getting that mix of investments, or what we call the asset allocation, right, it's really dependent upon a few things like your age, how long you've got till your retirement, and just your personal risk profile. And look, there's no one size fits all answer to that really. But look, it's vitally important that you do review that and make sure you have the right investment option. Because I guess a person who's in their 20s or 30s, who's not retiring for another 20 or 30 years, they can afford to be a little more risky, a little more aggressive with their investments than someone who's just about to retire.
Yeah, exactly. So if we can encourage you to do anything, it'd be one, go have a look at how your super's invested, just to get an understanding how much risk you're actually taking. In addition to reviewing your super fund and the investment options, it's also a good time to consider whether it's appropriate to make additional super contributions, so above and beyond the 9.5% that your employer makes. So some of the advantages of making those contributions is that you can potentially reduce the amount of income tax that you're paying along the way. But the main advantage is, for the long term, you're moving money into what's called the concessionally taxed superannuation environment, where whilst you're working, it's taxed at up to 15%. And then once you retire, the earnings become tax-free, the income becomes tax-free. So it's quite an attractive option there.
Absolutely. So there's obviously huge advantages for putting money into super, but there are some disadvantages as well, which is probably worth running through. Firstly, there are contribution limits that apply. So if you are thinking about putting extra money into super, it's important to be aware that what those limits are and making sure that you don't exceed them. And again, if you are putting money into super, I guess the one disadvantage is that you're not going to have access to that money immediately. So you're really, I guess, putting money away for use in the future. But probably the biggest disadvantage with making extra super contributions for most people is that they can't actually access that money out of super until they meet what's called a condition of release, which for most people is not until they retire after the age of 60. So if you are thinking of putting extra money into super, you kind of need to be pretty comfortable that you're not going to be able to touch that money for possibly many years.
And one of the things that we find too is, whilst they can be a downside, it can also be a positive. So for those people that sort of want to have that money quarantined so they're not tempted to dip into it, it's a good way of keeping that separate and compounding and generating some interest along the way.
That's a good point. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time just talking a little bit about insurance. And at a really high level, I guess we're talking about personal insurance here. So there's really 4 main types of insurances that you can get personally. And they're life insurance, TPD, otherwise known as total and permanent disability insurance. Then there's income protection. And those first 3 you can hold either inside super or outside of super. And then there's the 4th one, which we probably won't spend a lot of time talking about today, but it's trauma, and trauma is the only insurance that you can't hold inside super.
Okay, so in terms of life insurance, what that's designed to do is if you were to die, it would pay a lump sum benefit to your beneficiary of the policy and allow them to repay or reduce some of your debt, and also have a lump sum to help support your family's living expenses. Total and permanent disability insurance, or TPD insurance, is similar in the sense that it provides a lump sum payment, but it's paid out in the event that you suffer an event where you are unable to ever to return to work again. So something like loss of limbs or a debilitating disease. Similar to life insurance, it's designed to be able to help reduce or repay your debt. also help your family's living expenses and any modifications to your home.
And then the third type of insurance is income protection. And so income protection is designed to pay you, a percentage, so up to 75% of your income in the event that you were unable to work for a period of time. And so it's really designed to, help fund your sort of day-to-day living expenses. But it's important just to recognise that if you are going through career transition and your job's been made redundant, that's actually not a reason that you can actually claim on your income protection. It's a common question that we get from many people, I guess, isn't it? So that's sort of the three main insurances that you can hold within super. But I guess at a really general level, the thing to think about with insurance, no matter what type you're talking about, is do you have the right level of insurance? We often see some people who have perhaps got too much insurance and they probably really should be reducing it. And then of course you've got some people who might not have any insurance at all or not enough insurance. So reviewing the level is really important. And even just reviewing the actual policy itself or the insurer that you're with to make sure that you've got good quality cover.
Yeah, and with employer insurance policies, so a lot of the time there'll be life and TPD insurance, which is held through superannuation, or income protection insurance, which could be held outside. So your employer policies are funded by the employer, or at least part of it is. When you leave your employer, you generally have the option to continue that cover at your own cost. We would generally recommend taking up that option, at least in the short term, before you can sort of get a better understanding of what your current needs are and what your options are going forward.
Because there's a huge risk that your insurance might lapse if you don't take up that cover, right?
Exactly right. The last thing you want is you've lost that cover and then you try to apply for new cover and there's either going to be exclusions or loadings on that, so you're not getting the policy that you're after there. Another key area to look at with insurance is understanding whether you're paying too much. So look, it's great to have all the insurance in the world, but at the same time, affordability is a major factor in there. So it's worthwhile reviewing what current cover you have, how much you're paying, are there better policies out there from a contract perspective, but also is it a bit cheaper? If you can get a similar policy or a better policy at a cheaper rate, then it definitely makes sense to explore that further.
And another thing to think about with income protection, that we often suggest for some clients is there's often a really good advantage in thinking about holding your income protection outside of super. And there's some good advantages of that, which can be often you can get better policies outside of super. A great advantage is that you can claim a personal tax deduction on that money, which you can't claim, if it's held within super. So a lot of the times we do speak to clients about, transferring their income protection from super into their own personal name, which particularly works if they can afford the premiums.
Meeting short-term expenses is the most immediate concern a lot of people going through career transitions have. We find it's an opportune time to sort of sit back and get a handle of what your true living costs are. This will assist you with managing your short-term cash flow needs and also, especially when you're close to retirement, get a good understanding of whether you're on track to have a comfortable retirement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the questions that we get from people who are, particularly nearing retirement or approaching retirement is, how much money can I actually generate in retirement, or how much, should I have accumulated in super? And there's clearly no sort of one size fits all answer to that question, but there was a recent study done by the Association of Super Funds Australia, or ASFA, and they came out and said that for a couple who are wanting just a comfortable retirement, they'd need around $60,000 a year of income, or around $640,000 in super. Whereas a single person would need around $43,000 of income, or around $545,000 in super. And that factors in also them receiving some Centrelink entitlement as well. So having said that, that assumes a fairly basic retirement. So it really just covers your basic living needs. So if you're hoping to have a more comfortable retirement, then you really want to be planning on, having amounts greater than that.
Yeah, so we refer to that as a no compromises retirement. So things like where you're doing, could be an overseas trip every 1 or 2 years in retirement and some of those type of events.
Another thing to think about when going through a career transition is reviewing your assets and your debt. And I guess one thing that we find is that a lot of people over time they have a relatively haphazard approach to accumulating assets, and often there's no real strategy or plan behind that. So we think even just reviewing your existing assets is often a really good thing at this time, and just looking at is the investment itself a good investment? Should it be kept? Should perhaps you be selling some investments that are no longer particularly good investments? And even looking at things like the ownership or the structure of who's owning the assets. Perhaps should an investment be held in someone else's name, or should it be held in a family trust or a company or something like that? And then you've got tax implications as well. So looking at the tax that you might be paying on on existing investments, or even considering what CGT, what capital gains tax you might pay if you were to sell some existing investments. They're all things that really should be considered when you're looking at particularly your assets. So so there's some things that we think you should be thinking about when it comes to your assets and I guess and your debts as well. Whether it's your debts, your offset accounts, things like that. They're all things that really should be considered if you are going through a career transition.
Yeah, so we find offset accounts are a great tool to initially park your money from the redundancy in order to get it working straight away. So some people aren't aware of what an offset account is. So essentially the way that it works, it's like a transactional account that's linked to your mortgage or your investment loan. And rather than earning an interest rate on that money, you are able to offset the interest that you'd be paying on the mortgage. So the benefits of using an offset account include giving that flexibility. So if you need to access some money from time to time, you can do that without having to go to the bank and asking them for some money and then explaining what you need the funds for. And also it's, as I touched on, rather than earning an interest rate on that money, you're saving on the interest on your loan. So generally the rate's a bit higher than what you'd be getting on a normal savings account, where rates are around 1 to 2%, compared to mortgage rates of being 3, 4, or even 5%, depending on where. The downside of using an offset account, though, is if you're not disciplined, it's very easy to dip into that money and essentially erode it. Yeah, so we've got to be careful around how you use that there. But if you are disciplined, it is quite a powerful tool. So hopefully that's given you some good tips and insights around what are the key considerations when going through career transition.
Yeah, and if you do want to get a better insight into perhaps your own personal financial situation, feel free to go to our website and check out our free financial health check.